There is a dead zone in the sky that commercial aviation discovered entirely by accident, and it sits exactly where every single long-haul flight you have ever taken chooses to spend most of its time. 35,000 feet above the ground, roughly the altitude where weather stops and space begins, aircraft weighing close to 1 million pounds cruise at speeds that would outrun a rifle bullet. No one told passengers this was a sweet spot. No one explained why. The engineers just found it, proved it mathematically, and built an entire global industry around it. So why here, at this specific altitude, and not higher, not lower, not somewhere that makes more intuitive sense? Most people, when they think about this at all, picture the airplane simply climbing until it finds smooth air, and the way a swimmer dives below choppy surface waves to find stillness. The higher you go, the reasoning goes, the calmer and cleaner the flight. And that logic is not entirely wrong. The air up there is indeed smoother, the jet stream notwithstanding, and the sky above the weather systems feels almost serene compared to the turbulence lurking inside a thunderhead. So naturally, the assumption is that engineers chose 35,000 feet for comfort, or perhaps for some regulatory reason, a number plucked somewhat arbitrarily from an aviation committee meeting in the 1950s. That assumption misses the entire physics of the situation by about a mile, and also by about 35,000 feet. Here's the number that tends to stop people. The air at cruising altitude contains roughly 1/3 of the oxygen molecules found in the same volume of air at sea level. 1/3. To put that in human terms, if you opened a door in the fuselage right now and tried to breathe, you would lose consciousness in approximately 12 seconds, the same time it takes to read this sentence aloud. The aircraft cabin is pressurized to simulate an altitude of around 8,000 feet, not sea level, which is why long flights leave some passengers mildly groggy. But the engines themselves breathe the thin outside air directly. And this is where the entire story of cruising altitude really begins. This is what nobody tells you about why airplanes fly where they fly. It is not primarily about smooth air, or about avoiding weather, or about any preference of passengers. It is about the intersection of two competing physical forces that pull in exactly opposite directions, and the narrow band of altitude where those forces happen to balance most efficiently. That band is 35,000 feet. Miss it by too much in either direction, and the airplane burns dramatically more fuel, carries less payload, or quite literally cannot sustain flight. The engineers did not choose this altitude. The atmosphere chose it for them. The first force is aerodynamic drag, which is the resistance the air pushes against any object moving through it. Drag increases with air density. The denser the air, the harder the airplane has to push through it. At sea level, the air is thick enough that flying fast through it demands enormous engine power. The way running through water demands far more effort than running through open air at the same speed. As you climb, the air thins, drag drops, and the engines can sustain a given speed more easily, which means burning less fuel to go the same distance. So climbing is good. Climb forever, and drag keeps falling. Except that climbing does not go on forever without a consequence. The second force is lift, which is what keeps the airplane in the sky at all. Lift is generated by the wings, and it depends on the density of the air flowing over them. Thinner air means the wings generate less lift. To compensate, either the airplane slows down, which reduces lift further in a spiral toward a stall, or the wings pitch to a steeper angle, which increases drag and introduces new instabilities. High enough in the atmosphere, the air becomes so thin that even maximum engine thrust cannot push the airplane fast enough to generate sufficient lift, and the aircraft reaches what engineers call the coffin corner, where the minimum safe speed and the maximum safe speed converge to almost the same number, leaving essentially no margin for error. The name is not metaphorical. So the atmosphere presents this paradox. Climb to reduce drag, but climbing reduces lift. The sweet spot. The altitude where these two forces balance at their most efficient ratio depends on the weight of the aircraft, the design of its wings, and the specific thermodynamic properties of the atmosphere at various heights. For the wide-body commercial jets that carry most of the world's passengers, the mathematics consistently resolves to somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 feet. With 35,000 feet representing a kind of gravitational center of that range. And here is what makes it even more remarkable. The tropopause, the boundary layer between the lower atmosphere and the stratosphere, happens to sit at almost exactly that altitude, above the mid-latitudes where most long-haul routes travel. The calmer, drier air of the stratosphere begins right where the aerodynamics want to be. The planet arranged these things independently, and they coincided perfectly. The practical consequences of this were not understood clearly until aviation began pushing into genuinely high altitudes after the Second World War. The earliest jet airliners, including the de Havilland Comet, which enters the history of aviation engineering with a kind of tragic regularity, were designed for altitudes around 30,000 feet, which seemed extraordinarily ambitious in the early 1950s. What those early programs discovered, sometimes catastrophically, was that the atmosphere at high altitude behaved in ways that ground-level intuition did not predict. Pressurization cycles fatigued metal in patterns no one had calculated. Temperature swings of more than 200 degrees Fahrenheit between the ground and cruising altitude expanded and contracted the airframe thousands of times over a single aircraft's life. The engineering of what seems like a simple question, how high should we fly, turned out to require solving problems that did not even have names yet when the first jet passengers boarded their flights. The generation of aircraft that came after those early disasters, the Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, and then every wide body that followed, were built around a much more precise understanding of what happens at altitude. Wing designs were refined for the specific density ratio between sea level and 35,000 feet. Engine bypass ratios were optimized for the same target. The entire architecture of a modern commercial aircraft is calibrated around that one number, the way a musical instrument is tuned around a specific pitch. Change the target altitude significantly, and you would need to redesign essentially everything. Once you see this principle, you start finding it in unexpected places. Your car runs less efficiently at high elevation because the thinner air starves the combustion of oxygen in exactly the same way it affects jet engines. And mountain climbers above 8,000 meters enter what they call the death zone for the same atmospheric reason that defines the coffin corner in aviation. Hot air balloons climb until the density of the gas inside matches the density of the surrounding air, a lift versus drag equilibrium in the most literal possible form. Insects cannot survive at high altitude because their respiratory systems, which rely on passive diffusion of oxygen, fail below a certain atmospheric pressure threshold. Birds that migrate at altitude, like bar-headed geese crossing the Himalayas at nearly 30,000 feet, have evolved hemoglobin with a binding affinity for oxygen so much higher than other species that biologists still study it as one of the most extreme adaptations in vertebrate life. Weather satellites orbit where they do because the atmospheric drag that would decay their orbit becomes negligible above a certain altitude. Even the design of a ski jump is calculated around the density of the air at the specific elevation of the venue. The honest trade-off here is that the efficiency of cruising altitude comes with a cost that the aviation industry manages but never eliminates. Pressurizing a cabin to 8,000 feet equivalent is a compromise, not a solution. Passengers who fly frequently and are sensitive to altitude notice the difference in how they feel after a long flight compared to the same duration in a car. The pressurization cycles that work the airframe are real, measurable, and finite, which is why aircraft have operational lifespans measured in pressurization cycles rather than just calendar years. And the coffin corner is not a theoretical danger from the history books. Several accidents in the past 4 decades have involved aircraft that entered that narrow band of airspeed and altitude from which recovery requires exactly the right response within seconds. The atmosphere is precise about where it will cooperate and where it will not. And if you think the physics of cruising altitude is fascinating, wait until you find out why the shape of a jet engine inlet is one of the most precisely calculated curves in all of human engineering.